Oh, there he is. Hey, Scott.
Hey, how's it going, guys?
If you take a strap wrench, you can pull that right out.
Okay.
Your cat's already out.
Scott, we were just we're just sharing which beers we were drinking. You have anything open?
I don't have anything open. I just got home from work and hopped on quick.
Yeah. Thanks for joining us, man. This is fun.
Absolutely.
I don't know if you got the full background when Doug reached out, but we've been using this as an opportunity to like go through our wish list of people that that would never be available to us as a local homebrew club, hanging out at some at the bar that's happy to host us, and we're lucky to get sales reps from like the major craft brewers and stuff like this. But we just decided we were going to start reaching out and see who we could get to join us. And everybody's been like throwing out their dream guests. And you came up a couple of times as a potential guest. And Doug, I think, was the one that started the conversation and reached out to you to try to set this up. But there's a few people here today that have the book and are huge fans. And Doug, you want to give your intro? And
yeah, sure. So I used to follow Mike's blog for years, Mad Fermentationist, and
that was your first mistake.
Yeah. I still haven't made a sour yet, but soon enough. And then when I saw that he was opening up a brewery, I was like, wow, I gotta check it out. And so I had an opportunity where we were going to St. Michael's for a weekend, and so I told my wife, I'm like, I can't get that close and not swing by, and so we did, and he gave me a quick tour and said, hey, my partner wrote this book on hazy IPAs. You want a copy of that too? And he said, I'll get him to sign it. And I was like, oh, no, don't bother him. I knew you guys were busy. But then ended up ripping through that book on the vacation, and it's definitely changed the way I make IPAs for sure. I learned a ton of stuff that I would never have been able to get out of all those journals that you read.
Oh, that's cool. That's cool to hear. Thanks for sharing that.
Yeah. And then I started reading your blog as well. And your dip tube filter idea is something that I haven't yet modified my corning keg yet, but I'm going to. And I just use it for a siphon filter right now, but I'm going to modify the keg to do that as well.
Cool.
But lots of super useful stuff, even though the book is informationally dense. There was a ton of stuff that I took from it immediately. The first one that comes to mind is adding my hops when my water temperature is lower. The whirlpool. Had never heard anything about that. And
yeah, there's just I still have to, like you said, it's so information dense that even today I still open it up and flip through the index because I can't remember all those small details. But yeah, it was like a two year project where I was just reading hundreds of academic articles, and then if anything sort of caught my eye, I would sort of put it aside and slowly started trying to piece things together in a way that would be helpful to myself when I was crafting recipes, and then was just kind of hoping that I was just going to write a bunch of blog posts, and then I realized like there's just too much for that short sort of format, and then I actually went and talked to Mike early on to ask about his experience writing a book and if it was really something I wanted to venture out to do, and he was like, yeah, man, you got to go for it. So it's fun to hear. It's fun to hear stories of people actually like winning a competition, and they'll be like, I tried your method from the book, and it's cool to hear that kind of stuff. So thanks for having me on here tonight. I'm happy to do it, and thanks for coming to the brewery and for getting a copy of the book.
Yeah, the beer was delicious, by the way. I
Thank
took
you.
3 different kinds with me. It was, I really like the style of the way you make the IPAs. I like hazies, but I don't like sweet ones. And I'm lactose intolerant on top of that. So now I have to check every single beer to make sure they haven't put any lactose in it.
I hear you. I'm not lactose intolerant, but I've eaten a plant-based diet for about 10 years. And so that's no lactose. And so that's, Mike's gone in with that, with me. We don't do any lactose in any of our beers. And frankly, I don't think you need it. I think you can build in that sort of, enough sweetness and get that kind of soft character just through, your recipe, and not so much on relying on lactose.
Another thing that you wrote about in your book that I was kind of surprised. I had heard about people doing mash hopping, and I always read about it and them speaking about how you were going to get different extraction. But the one thing that you talked about in your book was that is actually helpful for haze stability.
Haze stability, more not so much haze stability as just overall stability of hazy beers. Because a lot of those, I don't know if any of you guys you make hazy IPAs often, but they can go downhill pretty quick. You can sometimes even see a coloring change on them in a matter of days if oxygen is getting in just a little bit at packaging. You can just really see that color go down or darken, and then you'll also just see a loss in that bright, fresh hop character. So mash hopping is something we do in the brewery for pretty much every hoppy beer. We throw in 2 or 3 pounds. I think that would be about an ounce or so is all for a 5-gallon batch or 5.5 gallon batch. And it's really just whatever we have on hand was open from a previous batch or something. We're not too concerned with the actual hop. We're just trying to get alpha acids and beta acids in early. What alpha acids can do is they can complex some of those problematic metals that will cause oxidation issues down the line when and if oxygen is introduced. So if you mash hop even before you adjust for your mash pH, because alpha acids are actually better at complexing some of those problematic metals when your pH is higher. So if you add throw an ounce of hops in right when you mash in, and just kind of let them do their thing, and then 10 minutes in, check for your pH, and then add I don't know if you add lactic acid or phosphoric or acid malt, but that's what we do at the brewery. And it's just something that the science suggests, and for us it's like, why not? It's like it's a good insurance to try to preserve that fragile style. And I always tell people too, it just smells good, so you might as well have a good smelling mash early in the morning or whenever it is you're brewing.
Yeah, I actually experienced that one time when I filled a growler and didn't fill it all the way up and do counter pressure. And I didn't open it up for, I don't know, it's probably 6 hours later. They brought it with me someplace. And when I opened it up and poured it, it had been a brighter, cloudier IPA, a little more orange. And by the time I poured it, it was starting to look not quite brown, but getting in towards a rust color. And yeah. I told the people I brought it for, I'm like, I don't know what happened.
No, I feel you. I remember I had so I was a member of, and Mike was too, and we still are, members of the DC Homebrewers group. And I had a good friend that he was always super paranoid. He made really good hazy hoppy beers, but he would have to ride his bike to the meetings, and he was convinced that every bump he hit was just whatever oxygen got in during that fill, that he was just oxidizing around the way. But you're right, a matter of hours, that can happen. I even have had some homebrew batches of hazy IPAs that oxidized in primary. Just a small leak in the primary fermenter can do some damage after fermentation is complete, because you don't have any more CO2 off gassing. So any oxygen that might creep in can. And oxygen it's important on every scale, but some of the research suggests that the smaller the batch size, the more oxygen can have a negative impact. And it kind of makes sense, because if you think about we have like a 20-barrel fermenter at the brewery. And so if that's like a little over 600 gallons. And so when we're dry hopping, we have a 4-inch port that's just at the top. So the little oxygen that gets in is being diluted in over 600 gallons of beer. But when you're at home and you open up a bucket and you dump in hops or something, whatever oxygen, you're getting almost more oxygen in, but at a 5 gallon, 5 gallons of beer or a little more to kind of dilute it. So it's such a huge thing. And I don't know if you guys read Brewlosophy at all. They've done some stuff. I'm pretty good friends with those guys, but they do some stuff with metabisulfite. And that's actually something we use at the brewery quite a bit, just a very small amount. I think probably less than like a half gram of metabisulfite while you're dry hopping is a pretty good insurance, just to try to scavenge anything that gets in. And again, I think that's probably more important on homebrew level, which is I still do homebrew style batches at the brewery all the time. So I'll steal 5 gallons of wort from a tank before we add yeast or before we dry hop, because then I could just it's like a batch that's already done. And I'm more nervous transferring some of those 5 gallon batches than I am some of the full batches, because I don't want to screw anything up, and I'm taken right back to when I'm homebrewing, and everything I do, I think I ruined my beer. So I don't know if any of you are like that, but that's how I always was, still am.
Definitely. I don't want to dominate the conversation too much, but if anybody has any questions they'd like to bring up, please jump in. One of the other things that I pulled out of your book immediately too was colder and shorter durations of dry hopping. Sometimes I don't always have the time, or my schedule doesn't allow me to get the hops out of the keg as fast as I can, but it was something that I always make a note to see if I can do it cold, and for, I think it was up to 2 days, I think you said, is where it kind of peaks or falls off.
Yeah, it kind of depends on what you're after with beers. Some people kind of like them a little more vegetal and a little that grassier sort of harsh. I consider it harsh character because it can kind of get in the way of the tropical, more fruity compounds from hops. But yeah, we dry hop almost everything below 60 degrees, and that's where we start. And I just dry hopped the beer last night at 50. And some of our homebrew batches or homebrew style, where I'm just testing out hops, I'll actually throw them into a 5 gallon keg with that same filter that you were talking about. We have a bunch of those at the brewery, and that's in a 40-degree cold room, and then it's just under about 15 pounds or psi of pressure, and then I'll just shake that keg pretty good once a day just to kind of agitate them, because that cold temperatures can help drop out the hops a little faster than you might want. So some agitation can get them back in. But yeah, the warmer you dry hop, the more you can pick up some polyphenols and some harsher compounds. And the longer you're dry hopping too, especially at those warmer temperatures, those will increase. So we're generally, I think you get faster, and some of the research suggests you get faster dry hop extraction on the smaller scale. And so I think, faster and more efficient, so you can almost get away with a little fewer hops than we would use. Like a direct scale down of a 20 barrel batch, it would probably be too many hops for a 5 gallon batch. But yeah, we do most of our dry hopping for about 2 or 3 days, and then we drop the cone on those just to get all those hops out. And then we do multi-stage dry hopping, so almost everything gets double dry hops, which is a little harder as a home brewer. But if I were doing it at home right now, I would probably be dry hopping my first charge of about, 4 ounces or so, with probably a day or 2 left of fermentation, because that'll just help scrub some of that oxygen that might get in. And then I would probably try to do a closed transfer into a keg with the second dose of dry hops, just trying to keep that oxygen down as much as possible. But yeah, colder and shorter was never really how I was taught necessarily to do it early on, but the research really suggests that, yeah, it's pretty quick that you get extraction with hops. And And everyone knows, the colder the beer is after post fermentation is generally better anyway. So that's the method we kind of use right now.
One of
I got a quick question for Scott. You're saying colder. So so you're saying like really just almost like fermentation's done then to do all the dry hopping in that transfer, or you're still trying to get some fermentation and going on at the lower temperature?
We'll actually raise. You're still trying to get a healthy fermentation, so we'll raise. Usually, it depends on the yeast strain you're using. For us, we're using like a 1318 type variant, whether it's RVA Manchester or we have a local yeast lab that does like a 1318. And so we'll usually start fermentation around 66 degrees, and then we'll bump it to like 68 around day 2 or 3. And then we're around 70 to help finish it off. And then we'll give it about a day or two at 70 just to make sure everything's done and it cleans up nice. And then we'll do what we call like a soft crash, which we take it down to 58 degrees. And that's when we start our dry hopping.
58.
Do you use cryo hops?
Yeah, I'm a big fan of cryo hops, and especially in single hop beers. So if you're doing like, one of my favorite beers we've done is all Mosaic dry hopped IPA, and it was half with Mosaic cryo and half with Mosaic pellet. And it just, the two together, they're the same hop variety, but they give you a different impression. And together they just have a nice complexity that I love. We don't use cryo very often on the hot side just because the alpha acid's so high that you can't use a lot of it. You just pick up too many isomerized alpha acids. It'll just get too bitter. And frankly, I'd rather use as many hops as I can, like in the whirlpool, just to try to push as many compounds as I can get into the fermenter. So yeah, cryo. And then they advertise you can use them at like half of the rate you generally would. And I think that's mostly just because of the alpha acid content. But when we're dry hopping, we use them just like normal. So we're, if I'm going to do 10-ounce dry hop or an 8-ounce dry hop, I'll do 4 ounces of Mosaic T90 and 4 ounces of cryo. But I love cryo. In fact, we were just trying to find some Citra cryo to buy yesterday, and it's getting harder on the bigger scale. And we found like 1 ounce packages. We're like, man, do we want to open like 44 of these? It might be worth it. But yeah, I'm a big fan of cryo.
I have a question about your opinion or impression about hop creep. Now, it's probably not something that a lot of home brewers experience, but in terms of the source of hop creep, since it's like quote unquote a new phenomena, the hypothesis put forward is that these places are kilning their hops at a lower temperature to preserve a lot of oils and a lot of aroma, and that makes sense that you're not going to kill as many enzymes that might be in there. So from your impression in any of your research, where do you think that's coming from? Is that a phenomena that you see, or do you think that, like with some other folks, they all think it's garbage?
Well, it's funny because you would think, wow, if this was such a problem, how has it not been happening, during the West Coast IPA craze or what have you? But I think that is the theory that I've heard, and that does make sense to me. If you're treating things at different temperatures, and you're preserving maybe a little bit more of that enzyme activity, it's definitely a real thing. I did a talk with the folks at Bearded Iris in Nashville, and they take incredible records, and they've seen some pretty serious hop creep issues, and it's just more like the longer they're letting, their fermentation can sometimes go for weeks because it just keeps going slowly and slowly because the enzymes are just slowly working on the dextrins, which in a hazy IPA you generally have more of those unfermentables, and that's what the enzymes in those hops are working on. So they free up those otherwise unfermentable sugars. And then a lot of times, like on the home or on the professional level, you get the yeast out completely just dumping through the cone, and which you can do now as a home brewer if you have some of the fancier conical setups. But if you get all the yeast out and then all of a sudden you free up new sugars, and then the yeast what's left in there is trying to re-ferment those, it's an unhealthy fermentation because, their friends aren't there anymore. They're just working kind of solo. And so that can cause things like diacetyl. And there's some research now that shows which hops, I don't have the list in front of me, but show which hops have been shown to have more of those enzymes. And so that's actually another reason why we start dry hopping at 58. That's the enzymes aren't as active at the colder temperatures, and shorter durations to help with that. But it is something we're a little afraid of, especially now that we're sending cans out in the world. The last thing I want to see is continued fermentation in that, and not even just diacetyl, but over carbonation. And there's some great research. I think it was I'm forgetting the brewery that started who has the hoppy table beer? It's Allagash, I think. Allagash is the one that surprisingly did some of the most groundbreaking early research on this, which is because they don't do a bunch of super hoppy beers, but they were the ones that reached out to some academics and got some help on it. But yeah, it's a real thing. But as a home brewer, especially if you dry hop a little cooler and you keep your beer cold and you keg it, it's not going to have as much of a impact. I would worry more about cans that sit out in a store shelf warm for a long time.
Right. Yeah. I mean, and that's like the big concern for most folks, right? Unless you can identify some kind of inert enzyme inhibitor that you can add to your cans,
yeah,
which would be pretty cool, right? But otherwise, it's just something you got to be really careful about, I assume.
Yep. And it's, for the most part, we haven't seen too many problems with it. And, that's, we would dry hop, Mike and I would both dry hop pretty early, even, a lot of active fermentation dry hopping at home. But I'm a little afraid too of just the enzymes just being in there for the duration of a dry hop, because that'll bring down that could potentially bring down the final gravity, because those enzymes could be working that whole week or so that it's warmer. And a lot of people, we found that people like sweet beers. The general public likes sweet beers. And so if we're finishing a hazy IPA at 10-18, that's too dry for a lot of people. Yeah. So we're generally trying to finish around 10-20 is sort of our sweet spot for IPAs. Sometimes you'll go a little higher for a double IPA, but that's just mashing pretty hot. But 10-24 finish is a pretty good double IPA finish for us, which is, we don't, they're higher calorie beers, that's for sure, but they're not nowhere near what I've seen in some imperial stouts. We've degassed some of the imperial stouts that we've gotten from some of our friends' breweries, and like super highly rated beers. People just love them, but we've seen final gravities as high as 1090.
Oh yeah.
So you're not putting the I mean, I think if you do the math, it's about a Big Mac per 12 ounces.
Wow. I think you just had that, or I just listened to the podcast of Brewilosophy, and you just talking about where you finished your beers like that. And that's the one thing I walked away with. I was actually going for a walk outside during all this COVID, thinking about what beer I'm drinking, and you're talking about finishing that high and Big Mac per 12 ounce. And so I went home and got the driest beer I could.
Well, they are kind of becoming more desserty in a lot of ways, and frankly, hazy IPAs have always kind of been that way. I mean, that's why I think they're so popular, is they're just more approachable because they're softer, they're a little sweeter, they're dry hop more heavily, but they're not as bitter. So there's hopefully more flavor without aroma, and then just have that creamy body. It's just more of an inviting beer. But what we still, we have a pretty big sour program at the brewery, and some of those finish, below 1. So we kind of are all over the place on our final gravities. But you know, we'll even I don't know, cheat is probably not the right word, but we'll use maltodextrin sometimes too. And if something finishes out too dry, we'll add a little maltodextrin just to bring that gravity up a little bit. But again, we're brewing both for what we like, but also, you know, we have to sell it, and so we kind of know what the general public likes, which is the great thing about being a home brewer, is you brew whatever you want and whatever you like, and so you can kind of just tailor it to your taste buds. But speaking for myself, calories aside, I do like those beers a little sweeter.
One of the things you spoke a little bit about it in the book, but I saw on your blog that you're playing around with some wine strains to pull out thiols. I mean, do you think that that's going to continue to be a trend amongst brewers that are looking for that different flavor profile?
Probably not. I've done it. I've probably messed with about 10 different wine strains and hoppy beers, and it's hard to find a wine strain that doesn't have a negative fermentation character impact. So although it's having, like, you know, it's been tested to have the necessary enzymes to free additional compounds from hops, because hops have, you know, both open and bound compounds. The open or free ones are the ones that are just in the beer right away. Closed compounds they need an enzyme to break them down to free them up. So, you know, in the wine world, they're obsessed with this because, you know, a white wine, they put in the right enzyme, it just boosts that, like, fruity passion fruit kind of thing. And so they've been looking at this for a long time, and it's only more recent that the hop world is starting to pay attention. Vin 7 is one of the wine strains that I found to work the best. That's not phenolic-y. That's usually my complaint with those beers, is there's just like a weird phenolic thing that, despite still being fruity, it kind of ruins the style a little bit. But you can buy commercial enzymes that winemakers use, and I know even some hop or beer suppliers are coming up, like hop flour, I believe, is one that you can add directly to a beer, so you can get those active enzymes but not have, you know, another yeast strain to play a role in. Honestly, I've been amazed at the brewery when we've done a lot of co-pitched beers. You know, if we do, you know, 5% of a certain strain, that can make a huge impact on the beer. So we'll have like a wheat inspired kind of Hefeweizen beer. We use like 5% of a Hefeweizen strain, and it's banana-y. So it's amazing how little another strain can impact a beer. But I've had some good fun ones with wine yeast, and honestly, some of the ones I've liked the best have been hoppy lagers with wine yeast. And that probably has more to do with the colder fermentation. Temperatures can actually help retain those thiols better, which is, it kind of makes sense. The colder the beer, the less activity is coming out through the top. You know, it's retaining a little bit more. But yeah,
when you add those second strains of yeast, are you adding them all at the same time, or are you adding them throughout fermentation at different times?
I've done it both ways. Generally, if I can find dry yeast, that's the easiest, because then you can just, you know, measure them by weight and just add them at the same time. But generally, I like to just add them at the same time, because I'm never 100% sure what it's doing at each moment. And a lot of times, if I'm trying to push bioconversions, those are happening in the first couple of days. So it doesn't really make a lot of sense to add them later. In some ways, I mean, there's different methods of bioconversion. There's styles. There's glycosides that you can free up. But a lot of those, you know, the ones that we know happen in the beer world are happening in the first couple days. So generally, I think early on is easier.
Scott, we're within a day trip of your brewery, right? You're
Yeah, probably not too far. Yeah, I'm just south of Baltimore.
So what's the setup there, and how are you dealing with COVID?
We have, first of all, we're lucky that like beer is considered essential. And we've actually found that we have, I think Mike did the numbers last month, and I think we sold 50% more beer than we did the month prior. It's just been it's more of it's longer hours, and it's more manual, because we were set up to sell 95% of our beer out of our tasting room. So we were doing everything. We don't have a canning line. We have a bottler because we do a bunch of wine barrel aged mixed fermented sours. So we'll bottle those. But we have clubs that take almost all those bottles. So even those don't really get sold to the general public very often. So we had to buy, I wish I borrowed a can seamer from another brewery for the first couple of weeks. And we bought some Blickman beer guns, and we just took our kegs out of our cold room, and we'll keg off, or we'll hand can. We call them mini crowlers, so they're 16-ounce cans, and we say, drink them within a week. We just purge them with CO2 and fill, and then seam them, and then we have like we label each can with like a generic sort of sapwood label. But then we sell them online, and we've been pretty lucky, because whatever we pretty much are able to get in cans is sold by the end of the week. So today I spent 5 hours hand canning beers. But it's kind of just the way it is. But we are in a situation where, and we're lucky, but like last week or a couple weeks ago, we put out a new double IPA we do a bunch of like sorbet versions of double IPAs. So that's a double IPA with like vanilla beans and like orange zest. They go over really well.
Wow.
But we put out we actually had Ironheart, which is a mobile cannery, come in. And so they'll just can the entire thing in about 5 hours. So that was a whole batch, but it sold out in 2 days, and we had to limit the sales online each day because we were worried too many people were going to show up. So it took 3.5 weeks to make the beers and 2 days for them to disappear. So now we're just waiting for the next batch to ferment. So I think COVID I think people are bored at home, and they maybe are drinking a little more than they were before. But so we're in a lucky position. But you asked about our setup, and it's a 10-barrel hot side setup. We have a hot liquor tank, but honestly, we don't use it very often. Usually what I'll do is fill our kettle the night before brew day, just a carbon filter. And that way in the morning, when our Mike comes in, he can just turn on the kettle to get it to mash temperature or strike water temperature, and then pump it over to our mash tun, where we have 10 barrels is about where you almost have to have electronic or a motorized rake to stir everything, or it's just too heavy. And it just makes mashing out a lot easier too. And then we mostly have 10-barrel fermenters, but we have one 20-barrel fermenter, and that's where we double batch. So we brew twice in one day to fill, and that's generally our double IPA, since those are the ones that go the quickest. And we're waiting on 3 more 20-barrel tanks that we've been waiting for about 3 months. But they've been stuck in China's port for 3 months, and there's no update on it, so we don't know when they're going to come. But that'll help us quite a bit produce more beer.
In the setup of the breweries, there's food, and it's like a full pub experience there.
It was we have so it's 7,000 square feet total. A little over 3,000 square feet is our tasting room, and then the rest is kind of split between where we make beer, and then we have like another side which is kind of more Mike's side. That's all of our sour stuff. And then we just do the food truck thing. Okay. So food trucks come pretty much every day we're open. And then, people can bring in their food or whatever. We'd love to put in a little restaurant or something. But it's just the licensing is the obstacle on a lot of these things. If you change your food license, you got to change your your brewing license. And so we'll get a better hang of it later, but maybe a good move is just to buy your own food truck, honestly, and have that at the brewery all the time.
So you've only been open, what, 18 months or so? Is that
Yeah,
right?
that's about right. Yeah, a little over, or getting closer to two full years. So it's been a great start for us. Like I said, I think we're pretty lucky that people have been supporting us like they have, and it's been fun too to put out. So like today, we just blended two wine barrels of like an apple triple that had a bunch of mixed culture bacteria in it. And it's fun for us because you have both like all of us, like beer nerds that are excited about like mixed firm, weird tasting beers, but then it's fun to watch the general public that doesn't know a lot about beers, like, why would I pay $14 for a what looks like a wine bottle of beer, and then they taste it like, well, this doesn't taste anything like beer. And so it's fun to both talk about our process with other homebrewers. We get a lot of homebrewers that come in, which is fun, but it's also fun just to kind of educate the general public on some of these unique styles. And hopefully when we go back to normal, people will go to tasting rooms again.
Hey Scott, I got a question for you. What's the next thing you're gonna research, or what's the next thing now that you're commercial brewing that you're like, oh, I need to research more on this? I mean, what's on the frontier?
Yeah, I can't stop researching about hops. Yeah, just the other day we did our first recirculation of dry hopping, and that was inspired by some research that you get about almost up to 40% more extraction from hops from recircing, even if it's like for 20 minutes. Honestly, I tasted the beer today, and I didn't think it tasted any better than we just burped from the bottom of the cone. So sometimes the science doesn't always translate to the palate, but I'm still interested in thiols and trying to really push those. Thiols more and more just seem to be some of the most important part of hops, and their sensory thresholds are so low. So if whatever you can do to sort of bump them up just to that higher sensory or that higher parts per million figure, it's might do wonders for some hoppy beer. But otherwise, Mike and I are getting a little more obsessed with trying to research more about high gravity brewing. That's kind of more where it's clear to us that's where the market is for, if you want to call them like hype beers, or beers that are going to get people in line. And so we'd like to get a little better at that. So we're doing more research into just good clean ferments into pretty high gravity beers, well above 10. And Thursday we're going to brew another imperial stout that's a 4-hour boil. It's like, I don't know, what do we pitch, like 6 bricks of dry USO5, and so it's more of like research into like how much oxygen do we need for those beers, how should we treat the water different in those, because there's just so much malt, and malt itself carries a lot of chloride, a lot of gypsum, and so we're always just trying to dial things in, and then we're pretty interested in the smaller stuff too. So now when we start canning, we have the canning line, when they come in, they have an expensive DO meter, so a dissolved oxygen meter tests how much oxygen you're getting in your beer. So now every time they come, we know exactly, all right, how did we dry hop this particular beer? Did we have metabisulfite? Did it not? Did we use a dry hop doser? Did we just open the 4-inch port and dump them in? Did we purge the headspace while we were doing it? And then you can kind of see those figures and see what parts in the process are helpful or harmful to something like an IPA, where oxygen is so important. Well, every beer, but it's particularly IPAs.
But good question. Like, is on the DO stuff, on the dissolved oxygen, I mean, definitely on the IPA stuff, we all know that's important. But you finding that it doesn't matter what beer you have, you're starting to kind of like manage that, or watch it at least.
Yeah. So we just, for example, canned a coffee porter, and I love coffee beers. I've done some research. That's another area I've done a little bit of research in, and For me, coffee beers, when they don't taste great, have sort of a green pepper taste to them. And that's, to me, is like an oxidized coffee flavor. So any oxygen that's getting in both to the coffee and the beer can help increase that quicker. So like we like to unitank a coffee beer, for example, because then if you're never transferring it, the rate for picking up anything is a lot less. You don't really need to transfer to a bright tank with a beer that doesn't have a lot of hops. Everything should, the yeast should settle out pretty much on its own. And the other thing with coffee beers is we tend to coordinate our not the brew day necessarily, it's more post-fermentation, dry beaning with coffee, but with the roastery, so they roast it on the same day that we add it to the beer, because coffee off-gases CO2, that's why it's in those bags with the CO2 breathers, so they off-gas the CO2, but then oxygen's not getting in the bag. And so the idea is that the coffee beans are actually off-gassing in the beer that same day you have it, so they're never really exposed to oxygen, and that preserves the fresh coffee character and doesn't get that green pepper kind of almost sometimes like jalapeno flavor.
Do you leave the beans whole for that, or do you crush them to get more CO2 release?
We leave them whole for the most part. I talked to Tim Windable is kind of like the coffee guy in the world. He's this guy from Norway. He invented, for the most part, light roast coffee, the fruity, more aromatic ones. I actually reached out to him, and I was like so pumped that he responded to me. But he suggested that the coffee beans, whole beans, are a great way to get aromatic qualities from coffee in a beer, but you might not translate to coffee flavor as much. Almost like dry hopping will give you more of the intense tropical flavors, but it won't necessarily be saturated, that hop saturated thing you get from whirlpool hopping. So he suggested doing taking 15 or 20% of the beans and coarse grinding them and adding them at the same time. So that way those are kind of being like your cold brew flavor beans, and then the whole dry beans are more your aromatic ones, and then 24 hours or so is all you really need for that contact, and then you get them off, and we found it's pretty helpful. Our coffee beers, I think, hold up really well.
And what's your guys' dosage like?
Let's see. So we'll do. You know what? I'm going to actually look it up right now because I don't want to tell you wrong, because too much coffee goes a long ways. I want to say it's about 2 ounces is all per 5 gallons of whole beans.
And then would you still do the 15% of those as coarse grind?
Yeah, I've done it both ways, where I've just add them all as whole beans, and I think you do get a slightly more coffee flavor. You do about 15% or so of that as coarse as you really can for that same contact time. We're just checking our variant log, since we've done this so many times. Mike's a big Excel guy, and so something I have to enter it into a thing, which turns out to be very helpful, because we've done, I don't know, close to 200 beers, and you're like, oh man. I don't know if you've ever gone to a homebrew meeting and someone's like, what hops did you use in this? And you forget, and it's one of the only 3 you have on tap. So, but yeah, it's about 2 ounces per 5. And I wrote a blog post not too long ago on coffee beers, and that has more the breakdown and even one of our recipes in it, if you're interested into that. But
have you tried doing that like a 5 gallon? And does hydrostatic pressure with large tanks have any influence on that ratio in terms of the extraction you get?
Yeah, actually, usually when I'm adding coffee, I don't add it to the full tank. So I'll take a half barrel keg, and I actually have the same sort of dip tube sort of screen that I put on our half barrel tank, so it just fits around the sphere. It's like a 300 micron screen. And then we have some special half barrel kegs that It's like a 4-inch tri clamp. And so we can take the spear out, and then we have I just toss the coffee in whole, and then I just purge that keg quite a bit, 5-10 times, just try to get all the oxygen out. And then I just rack beer from the tank into that, and then put it in the cold room for 24 hours, and then push it back into the tank. So it doesn't have a lot of that extra pressure. I don't think that would matter a whole lot in terms of extraction with coffee. It just seems to extract so well and so quickly.
Well, I have one last question for you. Since I don't have a fermentation chamber and we're getting into hotter months, brewing with Kvike is something I'm going to be thinking about. Have you had any experience with it, and do you have any tips or recommendations?
Yeah, I've used it a few times at home. I used I think it's called Hothead, which is one of the early ones, with some success. I've tried it at about 3 different strains at the brewery with hoppy beers, and I've struggled to make a good, what I consider like a pretty good IPA with Kvike. It's just you can get some weird fermentation characters that can clash with the hops. And so I'm not saying it can't be done. I just think you need more of a neutral strain that's not going to have, just like kind of like I was talking with the wine yeast. If you get too much of a phenolic thing in with hoppy beers, it kind of clashes. But I haven't done a lot with it. So I'm sure it can be done, but I'm not very helpful in that regard, because after like 3 of them at the brewery, I'm like, I don't know if I want to do this anymore, and these aren't turning out so great. But and part of me too is, I understand as a home brewer, and if you don't have a way to keep it cold, like how it's a perfect strain for something like that. But then at the brewery, it's like, I spent how much money to keep these tanks cold, and I want to use some yeast that I can dial it in. But even if you can't, hoppy saisons are great, and that's another one you don't need temperature control. We do a lot of I don't know if you're afraid of mixed fermentation stuff in your gear, but we'll do. Mike has his mad fermentation strain that will ferment warm and then leave it at ambient for up to like 6 to 8 months before even drinking it. And that sitting warmer just kind of helps the bacteria get to work even quicker and produces some fun beers. We'll see a lot of our sour beers in barrels really start to take a turn for the better in the warmer months, as the barrels warm up and that bacteria gets going a little more. But yeah, I wish I was more helpful on the Kvike strains, but there's still some. I'm sure there's people online that are doing some tests to try out those strains. I was in Brazil. I was lucky enough to go to Brazil to give a talk, and none of the home brewers really had any temperature control, and it was question after question of Kvike, and I was like, man, I really should have done some research on this. And now it sounds like I still should, but
I think it's pretty early on that strain too. People are just messing around with it.
Yeah, exactly. And I understand, like, a lot of those fermentations can be really quick too. So you can get, I've seen people do like the grain to glass thing in like 3 or 4 days with a Kvike beer. And then we tried one at the brewery that was supposed to be more of like almost like a lager strain. So it was supposed to ferment like a lager, but we fermented it too cold, which was like 70 degrees. And it took forever to ferment, which was the opposite of kind of what it's supposed to do. But of course we didn't heat it up. But I think what's his name? Lars, I forget if it's Lars blog or
Gershall.
Yeah. And he's, I think he just recently put out a book on it, and he's kind of the man in that area. So I would kind of lean on whatever he says.
Scott, are you guys doing any open fermentation?
Nope, we do. I mean, as far as like a cool ship type thing. Yeah, we don't. We don't really have the space to even have a cool ship. We're kind of maxing out our space already. We kind of do a more targeted approach to our sour beers and mixed firm beers, where a lot of them will be fermented in stainless clean. So just, a sack strain. We'll like a week in stainless, crash them out, and then add them and then go into wine barrels. And then we'll just do, we'll have like a bottle share. And if, a bottle from Europe is tasting awesome, sour, it's funky, whatever, we'll take those dregs and pour them into a barrel. And each one of our barrels gets a different set of bacteria. So even though we'll have the same base beer go into 5 different wine barrels, each one of those is going to come out a little different. And we blend all of our final beers, so it's more, we just don't want all of our eggs in one basket. If one of it's, let's say like one barrel is just, we just love it. We had a golden barrel that just had like the perfect blend of funk, but more of that fruity funk thing, not like the barnyard kind of funk. And it was sour, but not too sour. And it was just, we loved it. So what we did is we threw 5 gallons of that into 300 gallons during primary fermentation. And so that just kind of gave that beer, that base culture that we like so much. But then even when that goes into barrels, we'll think about adding separate bacteria from whether it's cultures from bottles we open, or even you can buy some pretty good mixed firm cultures now. We'll just use homebrew pitches from a lot of that stuff, because I mean, we've had Brett from one bottle make a huge impact on 300 gallons.
Wow.
So that's why sanitation is so important, because that was intentional. But if it wasn't, leaks. So we're more of a targeted approach, and this is kind of more Mike's area, but it's kind of his philosophy, and I agree with it, that you pitch yeast with a good resume, or bacteria with a good resume. If it's making really great sour beer for the Cantillons of the world, it's probably good enough for our little brewery in Maryland. So that's kind of what we do, and mix open fermentation, cool ship. It's so romantic. I get it. It's awesome, but it's also a lot more volatile, and I think it's harder to make great beer. And the people that pull it off, I'm amazed with. But it's for them. I think I just watched a good. I'm sure it's still up on YouTube. It was Jester King, Allagash. I can't. Some of the bigger American breweries that are doing cool ship stuff, and they just gave a kind of almost like a round table type of thing on how they approach it. And yeah, I thought it was pretty interesting, because it makes me feel good that they're like, yeah, this is not very easy. Weather plays a role, and sometimes we're not really sure what happens, and it's hard to take a lot of risks when you're not going to find out if this risk will how this is going to taste, because you take a chance now on something and you don't get to taste the beer for a year to really know if it made an impact. So, and if it doesn't taste good, then if you did it to all your beers that year, then you're like, oh man, we're kind of screwed for 2 or 3 years now. And so Mike and I are like, oh, that scares us. We'll pitch dregs.
I have a question about sourcing hops. So, with all the emphasis these days on local and the variance that you get across the nation in terms of where hops are grown, even within the same variety, is it something that you guys have looked at and experienced? And if so, how do you approach it from a commercial standpoint? But then also, are there aspects about it that are really interesting to you that you're researching and trying to follow up on?
Yeah, that's a good question. And we'd love to use locals as much as possible, but the reality is, I don't want to sound negative on the hop growing that's done in Maryland, but it's just a different environment than the Pacific Northwest. And that's just kind of the reality of it. And so like when we use local ingredients. We're using more local fresh fruit during, cherry season. We'll get a whole bunch of cherries and add them to a sour beer that's been in a barrel for a year or something. That's where I think our local products shine the best in beer. But when it comes to hops, and this is something, I believe it was Sam, that he's the owner of Other Half that does a lot of popular hazy hoppy beers. He told me for the book that his biggest advantage is being able to pick his hop lots. That's his biggest advantage over other breweries. And after almost a couple of years of this, I would tend to agree. In fact, Mike and I today, we're just having a conversation about the Citra lot that we just used for an all Citra IPA. It's okay. Like it for a Citra, it should be a lot more bright, should be a lot more tropical, more citrus forward, and it's just a little herbal, kind of a little oniony. And so we emailed we have contracts, but we're not big enough to pick them. So, a lot of the suppliers require you to pick about 5,000 pounds of one variety just to go to pick your own lot. And so that's massive. I mean, you're doing your can sales, you're on the shelves everywhere if you're doing something like that, or at least locally.
I would say here in New Jersey we have Magnify Brewing, and those guys go into these contracts and they actually like name their beers like nasty names after the contracts for the hops because they have to lie so many.
It does make a huge difference from lot to lot, and so we're starting to pay closer attention. We had some Nelson Sauvin from Freestyle Hops, and I still am in love with that particular crop. And then like we've opened some Amarillo that we were gonna do a Simcoe Amarillo. Citra Amarillo beer, and we went to dry hop and opened the 11-pound bag of Amarillo, and we're like, nope, like that's not going in. Like, is it too late to change our label because we said it was going to be Amarillo? And but if it doesn't smell good, in the bag, it's not going to magically get better in the beer. And so that's something we're getting a little bit more obsessed with is how can we get the best ingredients for some of these? Like Galaxy is another great example. Sometimes to me, when Galaxy is just awesome, it smells like fruit stripe gum. It's just like the memory it gives me. But sometimes I'll open Galaxy and it's like it has some of that green onion thing. And at $30 a pound, it's like, man, now this is going to just be an expensive Whirlpool hop, But so we're trying to come up with ways to maybe you track the lots better, and then at least request certain lots and see if we can get them. But until you're big, it's a little more difficult. And as a home brewer too, it's even a little more frustrating because you don't always know where. I think sometimes now they say the lot is at YCH says you can look up the lot maybe. But I had some hit or miss with a lot of homebrew hop bags too. I would actually just buy, it wasn't the cheapest way to do it, but I would buy more than I was anticipating on using, especially if I was doing 1 ounce bags. And then I would just try to be honest with myself when I opened them. And it's like, all right, I'm going to waste $10 on this or whatever, but I'm going to use the best bags.
So what's your pandemic go-to beer? Like right now, what is your favorite? I got to have it. I really could use a beer, just came home from work and I'm going to crack it open.
So for me, it's one of our, it's usually one of our beers because they're the cheapest. If I'm filling, 5 hours of hand canning beers, we have a few underfills that I pretend have to drink quickly or they'll go downhill. So I'll take those underfills home with me. And for me, it's a beer called Rings of Light. It's just 100% Citra. It's, it's less than 5%. It's got all the qualities of a bigger IPA, but without all the alcohol. And, a couple of those is hits my sweet spot. And that one, Mike's actually on his blog, the Mad Fermentationist, has put the recipe out there for it. So it's it'd be one if that's something you're into, I would try to brew it. But otherwise, I will save some of our when we're labeling bottles or whatever. You can accidentally mess up the labels on some of the sour bottles, and so I have to take some of those home. But we've done a few Flanders Reds that are, you know, a little higher, like 10, 11%. But those are some of my favorites to have. If it's like the Friday or Saturday night, you're going to have like one good one.
Do I sense that you label the bottles by mistake on purpose?
Oh, I would never make a mistake on purpose to take home a beer.
Do you guys sell those bombers, the Flanders?
Yep. So we'll sell, we do them in 500 mil bottles. And those are, we're lucky that we have like a wood club, they're called. And so they are guaranteed most of those bottles, and then they have the right to buy even more. And then, so usually that means, you know, 100 or so is all that really gets released to the public, because we're also holding back, you know, about 100 or more to release in future years. So like, you know, 3 years from now, you can get the 2020 vintage of it. Which is the fun thing about sour beers. So I always joke, because if you were going to start a sour, only a sour brewery, I don't know how you could ever convince like a bank to give you money, because we designate about 20% of our budget, about 20% of the beer is probably going to go down the drain because it's sour. It might not be good. It doesn't belong in a blend, or it gets acidic or whatever. And so you're already out 20%, and then you're like, oh, then we're going to hold on to about 20% and sell it 5 years from now. But just like a bank would be like, all right, so like this is a business.
A bunch of it's going to evaporate.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, so we do, when we put beer into barrels, we usually fill a couple kegs, half barrel kegs, or we use all of our homebrew kegs for a lot of these if they have Brett in them, because if they're sitting in kegs too long, we can easily just release the pressure with a homebrew keg. It's a little harder in a half barrel keg, but so we'll keg off some beer just to top up those barrels after about six months or so to replace that angel share. But it's amazing how much beer disappears out of those. Like you fill 4 gallons into a barrel that just sat for 6 months that was completely full. It's kind of amazing.
That's happening with my corny cake right now. Amazing how fast it's disappearing.
It's got a leak. That I don't know if that's ever happened to you, but I have had a leak in my corny kegs. It's happened to me twice, where I came home and then opened up tried to pull a beer from my tap, and nothing was working. So I just thought I was out of CO2, and I opened up my keezer, and it's just full of beer. That's happened to me twice.
I just pulled about a gallon of Saison out of my keezer about a week ago.
Yes, it's not just me.
Terrible.
Yeah, it's not what it does not put you in the mood to even have a beer after that.
Well, it kind of put me in the mood to have many beers.
Could you just put a straw in your keezer and take care of it?
Yeah.
Well, Scott, we're coming up on the hour mark. I don't. If anybody has any other questions, this might be a good time. Otherwise, we greatly appreciate your time and your willingness to hang out with us and talk IPAs and sours and.
Thanks for sharing the knowledge.
No, I appreciate it. This is it's fun to do, because when you're forced to talk about what you do, it makes you rethink why you're doing it. So it's good to continue to do this, and of course, like Mike and I are just still homebrewers. I mean, that's what we are still. We each still have, like, I probably can't see it behind me, but I'm in my condo and I still have my 15 gallon barrel that I fill once a year and empty once a year, and it's a sour barrel, and so it's fun to do these kind of things, and it's nice to be asked and have people want you to do it. So happy to.
Yeah, thanks again, man. This is really appreciate it. And you're certainly close enough that you're going to be on our trip list. I'm sure you're going to see some of us popping in there.
Yeah, that'd be awesome. And if you do, shoot one of Mike or I a heads up. It's just our first names at sapwoodsellers.com. So we'd be happy to show you around.
That'd be great. I think some of us are going to take you up on that. I'm sure.
Excellent.
Hey man, you get the Beer Baron in DC?
Oh yeah,
DC over.
Yeah, I've been to. Well, now nothing's open, but yeah, DC's got a lot of great beer bars. Church Key is another one that's awesome.
Yeah, I love that place.
I used to go to the Brick Skeller way back in college.
Oh yeah,
yeah, that's the one that became Beer Baron. Same place.
Is that right? Yeah, that was the place where I discovered beer from around the world. It was amazing.
That's always it's almost overwhelming when you're in that position early on. You're like, wait, I thought I understood beer, but
yeah,
this is like starting over.
Yeah.
But yeah, what city are you guys in?
We're near Princeton, around Princeton, Trenton area. New Jersey. Yeah.
Is there any famous for the area beer bars around you guys?
Not really.
That's why you guys all make it at home, it looks like, by everyone not going like this.
It's only 45 minutes or so into Philly where you can go to Monk's. And that's a pretty good beer bar.
Yeah, that's usually my tap. Usually do the Tired Hands Monk's thing when I'm in that area.
Yeah.
Yep. Maybe we could all I'll do a screenshot if everybody does raise a glass as a toast to Scott. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Scott.
Thank you.
Thank you, Scott.
Thanks for
Really
having me,
appreciate
guys.
your time.
Thanks a lot.
This was nice.
Coming out tonight.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Staying in tonight.
Yeah, staying in. All right, see you guys. Thanks a lot.
Cheers. Thanks.
Take it easy. Cheers.
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 Hey, Mark.